Subscribe the channel and press the bell icon so that you do not miss any update from Rao's IAS. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an initiative by Rao's IAS Study Circle where we try to analyze the Hindu from the perspective of UPSC examination for prelims as well as mains. Displayed on the screen is a list of articles that we are going to discuss today. Let's begin our analysis. Dear students, we have a very important announcement for you. If you are looking for guidance for optional program, Rao's IAS Bangalore Center is conducting its optional counseling on 24th of July. This will basically be talking about 4 optional subjects: geography, public administration, history and sociology. So please note the time, and there is a link in the description which you can utilize for the purpose of registering for these sessions. Now, as far as these sessions are concerned, optional orientation for geography will be taken by Indrajit sir, and this will be conducted on Sunday 24th of July 10 a.m. Now these optional orientations are live online and you can attend these sessions online. Next is public administration. This will be taken by Anubhav Sharma sir, and the sessions timing are Sunday 24th of July 12:30 p.m. onwards. Next is history, which will be taught by Parampreet sir. The optional orientation will be taken on Sunday 24th of July from 3 p.m. onwards. And sociology will be taught by Mr. Vikram Kaushal, again on Sunday 24th of July from 5:30 p.m. onwards. So if you are someone who is looking forward for optional orientation in these subjects, these sessions are must attend for you. Do not miss them. Enroll for these sessions through the link in the description. Page number 14 of today's newspaper presents an article which talks about RBI to set up system to settle international trade in rupees. Now this topic is important more from the perspective of GS paper 3, and it will come under the topic of economic development. As a subtopic, it will come under Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Now this topic is important because we are aware of the fact that there is a regular flight of dollars from the Indian shores, and in this context, RBI has to take initiatives so as to strengthen Indian rupee and also ensure that the outflow of dollars is limited. In this context, this topic is very important. Now let us try to understand how this system will work. The first agency that we need to understand is the RBI itself. So RBI is the body which will actually choose authorized depositories. Now authorized depositories could be banks like State Bank of India. Now what these banks will do, they will actually take approval from the Foreign Exchange Department of the RBI. Now this is an important aspect. This is a more of a protocol that these authorized depositories have to fulfill so that in future they can go for settlement of international trade. Now the broad framework for the cross-border trade transaction in Indian rupees under the Foreign Exchange Management Act will be done in invoicing, exchange and settlement. Now in terms of invoicing, we need to understand all the invoicing will be done in the part of Indian rupee denomination. That is the important aspect. In this fashion, we will be in a position to strengthen the position of Indian rupee. Second important aspect is to establish exchange rate. Whenever we're talking about exchange rate, here the exchange rate will be established by the two trading countries, and in this context they will be driven by market forces. So second important aspect is the exchange rate. And the third important aspect is the settlement itself. Now the settlement of trade under this mechanism will be done in Indian rupees only. So this will basically help us in terms of maintaining sufficient balance and reducing the outflow of dollars from the Indian shores. So this is an important aspect that we need to understand. All these dimensions were basically controlled by Foreign Exchange Management Act of 1999. Now let us understand how these authorized depositories will basically work. These authorized depositories will first establish rupee vostro account in the territory where they are operational. For example, if it is SBI, it will set up a rupee vostro account in SBI India. These authorized depositories will also establish special rupee vostro accounts in the other country with which we are going to interact under this collaboration. Now let's assume that this country X is Russia. So SBI, the authorized depository here, will establish a special rupee vostro account. Now some of you would want to know what is vostro account. So vostro account is an account a correspondent bank holds on the behalf of another bank. These accounts are an essential aspect of correspondent banking in which bank holding the funds act as custodian for or manages the account of the foreign counterpart. Now you must be feeling that this definition is very technical in nature. In order to understand this properly, let me help you with another diagram. Now let us pay attention to this particular diagram. Here we can see that there is State Bank of India, which will establish the Vostro account. And there is a second bank, which is the SBER bank. This is the bank from Russia. Now, how this entire flow will work, let us help you in understanding that, for which we have defined the system in terms of two flows. First is payment for imports into India. Now, let's pay attention to the aspect of flow. First and foremost, you can see that the point number 1, it says that open a ruble account with the Sberbank in Russia. So it means that a special Vostro account is being established by State Bank of India in SBER bank. What happens afterwards? That this particular bank, which is of Russia, will open a rupee account with SBI in India. So you can see here, this is the point number 2. Now we are aware of the fact that India has dependence in terms of energy, and there is a company of Russia by the name of Gazprom. They basically produce oil and gas, and India is procuring this oil and gas through Indian Oil Corporation. So you can see that in the third point, there is a gas which is purchased by Indian Oil Corporation. Now whatever the payment that we need to do to Gazprom for this purchase, Indian Oil Corporation is going to make this payment into the SBR bank account with SBI. So here you can say that the money will be deposited in terms of INR, that is Indian rupees. Now here we will go to now point number 5. We can see it here. Now what the Russian agency or Russian company will do, they will draw the equivalent amount of rubles from the SBI account of SBR bank. So it means that the payment that we are going to make here, we are going to actually show in our account books in terms of payment in terms of INR, and here in the Russian bank they will make the withdrawal in terms of rubles, which is the Russian currency. And this fashion, what we are going to do, we are going to limit our trade in dollars, thereby saving the precious foreign exchange. Now in this context, it is also important for us to understand how the exports will basically work. Now in this context, let's move after the point number 5. Now similarly, when we are talking about the export, you can see that exports pharma drug to Russia, this is point number 6. And what the Russian company is going to do, Russian company is going to make the ruble payment in the SBI account of SBER bank, that is in terms of rubles. This is the point number 7, and once we look into this, point number 8 will come into picture, in which the State Bank of India will allow Reddy's Laboratory, which actually made the export of pharma drugs, to make equivalent withdrawal in terms of rupees from the SBR bank account with the SBI. In this fashion, the entire mechanism will unfold. Now you must be thinking how this mechanism or this new mechanism of trade settlement is going to benefit India in this entire journey. Now the first and foremost, it will allow or rather promote growth of global trade, emphasizing on exports from India. We are aware of the fact that many countries which are facing sanctions like Iran and Russia need lot of imports, since these countries are out of the SWIFT network or they cannot use it that much freely, and that is why this kind of a system will actually help us in terms of promoting our trade with this country, and which is primarily export centric. Now the second important aspect is that there are many countries which are basically supporting or rather showing a lot of interest in the Indian rupee. Now such countries can be Sri Lanka or any kind of crisis-stricken country which is not very willing to part of dollars easily. Now we can actually get into trade with these countries and we can establish better exchange rate through this system. This will actually strengthen the currency and in long run strengthen the economy as well. Now, once the currency becomes well established and widely accepted, it basically reduces the risk of currency fluctuation, which is primarily dependent on dollar or euro. In this context, when more countries are making trade in terms of Indian rupees, then this kind of a problem can be reduced. Recently, we have seen that rupee has weakened and it has crossed the value of 79 rupees 45 paisa. recently. Now, in this context, this kind of currency fluctuation, which basically bothers investors in an economy, this can also be taken care of. Now, the next important aspect is steps towards full convertibility of Indian rupee. Now, we have been planning to move towards full convertibility of Indian rupee, and this particular step or initiative, which will establish Indian currency's foothold across the world, can be a step in this direction, which will help us boost our trade, reduce risk of currency fluctuation, and thereby leading to full convertibility of Indian rupee. So, in this scenario, we can see that this entire situation can be converted into something where Indian rupee can establish its foothold and Indian economy can benefit by improving exports, limiting the outflow of dollars, more confidence amongst the foreign portfolio investors, and reduce the current account deficit. With this, let's move to the next article. Page number 8 of today's newspaper has a news item which talks about the search for dark matter. Now, recently, this particular news has become important because of the development in the field of technology. And this news is important more from the perspective of prelims examination. Now, there is a dark matter detector which is called as Lux Zeppelin. It is established in South Dakota of US, and because of which this particular news has become important for us. Now, in this context, let's first understand what is the meaning of dark matter and why dark matter is important for us. As the name suggests, the dark matter is something which is completely invisible, so we cannot see that. Now, the primary reason for this dark matter to be completely invisible is that this matter does not have any kind of charge. Now, we are aware of the fact that when we look at something, we can look at something because of the electromagnetic phenomena. Now, these particles or the dark matter, if we call about, they do not have any kind of charge, and that is why they do not create any kind of electromagnetic phenomena. And this is the reason they are considered to be dark. So, in a nutshell, they emit no light or energy and thus cannot be detected by conventional sensors or detectors. Now, as far as the prevalence of this particular dark matter is concerned, the entire universe, there is a huge prevalence of dark matter which we do not understand much. We are aware of the fact that right now the visible part of the universe is around 5% of the matter. Rest 27% of this universe is actually dark matter, and remaining 68% is dark energy. Now, we should also understand who actually discovered dark matter. It was the Swiss astronomer Mr. Fritz Zwicky in 1933. Now, let's try to understand what is the thought process which Mr. Fritz used to understand the prevalence of dark matter. So, in order to put it in simple terms, let's assume that this is a sun. Now, we can also assume that there is a small comet which is rushing towards sun. Let's assume that this is a small comet which is rushing towards the sun. Now, there are multiple aspects which are possible in terms of the trajectory of this particular comet. Now, one aspect is if the gravitational pull is strong, this comet can basically keep on moving in terms of orbiting around the sun in this manner. So, the comet can keep on moving in this direction. Now, there is another possibility that if the speed of this particular comet is very fast, in that case, what can happen that this comet can move towards the sun. It can actually get deflected a little, but at the same time it can move towards exiting the gravitational pull of the sun and can become free. So, in simple words, what we can say that Mr. Fritz basically identified that if any kind of massive body, if it has moving in a very fast way, then the gravitational pull, if it cannot sustain itself, then it definitely becomes free in this nature, as we can see through this particular explanation. Now, let us understand how Mr. Fritz basically discovered dark matter. So, he was actually observing the edges of galaxy, and he could see that there were many stars which were traveling at a very fast pace. And by his calculations, if these stars were traveling at a very fast pace, they should actually exit the gravitational pull of the galaxy. But at the same time, he could see that these stars were actually moving in this path and they were not escaping the gravitational pull of galaxy. Based on this particular thought process, he deduced that there must be a gravitational pull which was caused by some kind of dark matter. And this gravitational pull is actually keeping all these stars in their path. And through this mechanism, he could actually discover the basic concept of dark matter. Now you must also be thinking that is it possible to justify this particular idea of dark matter through any other mechanism? The answer is yes. There is one more mechanism which is basically accepted by scientists, and it is called as gravitational lensing. Through this picture we can understand what is the concept of gravitational lensing. Now imagine a scenario that there is a distant galaxy which is emitting light, and this is the Earth. This is where the light is being received. Now if there is a presence of huge gravitational influence creating bodies in between, what will happen? This light will basically bend. We are aware of the fact that light bends when it actually moves towards high gravity causing bodies, and this is what we can observe. Now in the basic study that scientists have done so far, they could identify this kind of light bending, and there is no other body to justify that but the presence of some kind of dark matter. So in this context, gravitational lensing concept also pays attention to the basic idea of dark matter and prevalence of dark energy. Now we know that by now you want to know more about what is dark energy. Now dark energy is something which is more prevalent in the universe. Roughly 68% of the universe is around dark energy, and there is a very clear-cut idea why dark energy exists. Let's understand this thing in simple terms. We know that after the Big Bang theory, the universe is expanding, and when the universe is expanding, what is happening? Now it is expanding at a very fast pace. In order to understand this, let's say this particular diagram. Now in order to understand this particular idea, let's assume that this was the state of expansion rate initially when the Big Bang actually happened. After some time, this was the expansion phase. Means this is how different planets or satellites or even galaxies were basically situated. Now as the time actually passes, we know that this stage is actually showing much broader or even expanded space because the space is expanding. Now here we can see that this is actually much bigger than what it was previously, and this is the basic idea about the expansion of space. Now the basic concept of dark energy is that dark energy is basically something that comes into existence and fills this expanded space. So you can see here this was a small space. Now when this space is expanded, it becomes much bigger. Then the dark energy is basically created out of nowhere, and this basically fills this particular space. Now in this context, as more space comes into existence, more of this energy of space appears. As a result, dark energy causes the universe to expand faster and faster. Now in this context, we can actually look into the aspect of dark matter and dark energy. Dark matter exerts the pull on the universe, and dark energy is actually a contrasting expansionary effect. Now when we look into any kind of statement which talks about dark matter energy, we also should understand that Einstein also in his gravitational theory made the prediction for this dark energy, and he basically said that empty spaces can possess its own energy. So this is something which is, you can say, that is in line with Einstein's gravitational theory, and he said that because of this energy is a property of space itself. As we expand the space through Big Bang, and then what happens? This expanded space is occupied by more energy. So this is actually would not be diluted. So this is so what he actually wanted to say is that this energy is not diluted as the space expands. As more space comes into existence, more of this energy of the space would appear. Now I believe that through this discussion, now you are clear about what is dark matter and what is dark energy. Page number 6 of today's newspaper presents an analysis which talks about the scam Faultline is damaging Indian banking. Now this topic is important from the perspective of GS paper 3 and will be covered under economic development. As a subheading to this particular topic, it will come under Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Now, it is very important for us to understand that the financial sector is basically the backbone of a country. And this financial sector, if it is infested with frauds, it may lead to increase in the non-performing assets or NPAs, which is going to be detrimental to the overall economy of India or any other country if you want to talk about. Now, in this context, we need to understand that the financial frauds that we see in the banking institutions are broadly divided into four aspects. First, of course, is management centric. Second can be someone who's an outsider like Vijay Mallya. He basically borrowed money and ran away. So this was an outsider generated scam or fraud. Third could be insider, where there is some kind of inside work which is going on. Maybe you can quote the example of Madhavpur Mercantile Bank, and many cooperative banks basically fall for this kind of a trap. And the last is, of course, a collusion between insider and outsider. And one of the examples that we can cite is the securities scam, which is a basically reflection of collusion of insider and outsider in terms of creating financial frauds. Now, whenever these kind of financial frauds are basically being created, they basically deter the financial sector in a big way. Now, when we talk about the Financial Stability Report, which is published by the RBI, it has been observed that the NPAs are expected to reach the level of 8.1% from the current level of 6.9% by the September 2022. Now, this shows that NPAs, as they rise, they basically create more burden for the banking institutions, and banking institutions will actually be very apprehensive in terms of borrowing and lending at the same time. Now, in this context, let's try to understand what are the primary reasons which basically cause people to commit fraud, whether it is bank or it is like common person. One of the primary reasons for the bank frauds or the frauds that we see is the collusion between the bank employees and outsiders. Now, it has normally been seen that the public sector undertaking banks, PSUs, the employees are not as well paid as the private bank employees, and in this context, this becomes a promising reason for the commitment of fraud. Second important aspect that we can highlight is poor lending practices. Now, this is a situation in which we need to understand that whenever a loan is approved and loan is disbursed, now the banking institutions must be having enough resources so that they can basically do asset monitoring. This kind of asset monitoring basically gives banking institutions time to understand where the things are going wrong, and based on that, they can take preventive or curative action. But right now, the banking institutions do not have right set of practices, because of which this asset monitoring is not possible, and this leads to fraud. Apart from that, it has also been observed that banks are under the duress to actually give more and more loans to people, and in such a scenario, when bank employees are under stress, they basically do not follow due diligence of law, because of which again asset monitoring becomes much more difficult, and it is a recipe to disaster. Now, the next important aspect that we need to pay attention to is issue of the corporate governance as such. Now, when we look into the banking institutions per se, the banking institutions in India are basically governed by two bodies. One is RBI and the second is the Finance Ministry. Now, when two bodies are regulating one banking institutions, then there is always a problem that is brewing, and that is the reason the corporate governance issues are very important. Apart from that, whenever we look into the banking board structure, we know that bank has independent board members, but these board members are not independent per se, and they're following one agenda or another. Recently, many cooperative banks have seen a lot of scams, and one of the prime reasons was the board members were not following the rules and procedures established by RBI in the right fashion. So this was also a reason for corporate governance causing fraud. The next important aspect is actually the lack of regulatory mechanism or proper regulatory mechanism on behalf of RBI, which also causes a lot of financial frauds. So first thing first, we need to understand that the adequate capacity when we talk about RBI for regulatory oversight over banks is actually limited, and that is one of the reasons why financial frauds take place in the very first place. Second important issue that we need to actually pay attention to is the issue of credit rating agencies. Now, credit rating agencies basically give ratings to bonds issuers, and these bond issuers basically pay fees to these credit rating agencies. Now, just try to understand a simple aspect. When credit rating agencies are basically being paid by the issuers of bonds, their opinion will be biased, and this is the reasons why we can see that the risk element, when it is even high, is actually rated lowly by these credit rating agencies. So credit rating agencies also cause reasons for the financial fraud. Third important aspect is when we talk about any kind of financial institution or system, we need to focus upon chartered accountant professions. Now, chartered accountant professionals are not very well regulated in India, and the Companies Act of 2013 has made a provision for regulating the conduct of chartered accountant in the form of National Financial Reporting Authority. However, the impact of such step or initiative is very limited as of now, and hence even the chartered accountants do not help in limiting financial frauds. Actually, at times they even help the people who are perpetrators of financial frauds. Last but not the least is actually weak and slow process of judicial accountability. Now, judicial accountability is a system which basically ensures that anyone who commits crime or any kind of crime that is dealing with the financial sector, these people are brought to book and brought to justice as soon as possible. But we have seen that at times judicial accountability is not working in a proper fashion, and hence there is something which is lacking in terms of the fear of law is not established, and this also leads to fraud in the financial sectors. Now, when we're talking about the kind of frauds which are happening in the financial sector, we need to understand that this is going to lead to increase in NPAs. And apart from NPAs, it actually does a lot of things. First and foremost, it erodes the confidence of the people, common people who basically rely on the banking institutions. Now, we are aware of the fact that the money which the banks basically lend is the money of depositors. Now, when the financial fraud is committed, the money of these depositors basically vanish. And when this happens, the entire viability of the financial system is questioned. And this is something which is the most significant impact of any kind of financial fraud. Now, eroding confidence is one aspect of this entire scheme. Second important aspect that we have highlighted in the start through NPAs is that this also weakens the balance sheet of the banks. Now, we need to understand that the banks need to be run professionally. And when you are running something in a professional manner, it means profit and loss have to be maintained well. Now, when banks do not have enough confidence in terms of the depositors, then profit and loss will be a loss-making journey for everyone. So this is again a very important aspect. The follow-up of this entire happening is something which is going to cause impact in terms of how we are borrowing or how we are lending. Now, in this case, what is happening that there will be more cautious borrowing from the part of the people, and there will be more cautious borrowing, and there will be more cautious lending from the banks as well. Now, whenever this kind of situation is happening, it means that there will be system, but that system is not going to help the people in terms of doing things easily. And that is why this cautious borrowing and lending becomes difficult for banks to actually manage. And this actually erodes confidence again. So there's a vicious cycle which is playing here. Now, banks have to actually transmit the benefits when they get in terms of interest rate cuts. Now, banks have to transmit benefits in terms of interest rate cuts as well. Now, when the banks are not very gung-ho in terms of the performance of their loans or any kind of assets in that sense, then they are not very willing to transmit these interest rate cuts, which basically makes lending and borrowing more difficult for banks as well as individuals. So the impact of frauds of NPAs is actually multidimensional. It impacts banks as an institution and body, it impacts depositors, and it impacts people who have borrowed money as well. So all the stakeholders in this entire scheme of things, they basically get impacted because of fraud. So this brings us to the important discussion in terms of reforms that we can basically implement in terms of loan recovery. Now, whenever you look into the reforms, we have identified the problems. Based on the identification of problems, we can actually suggest solutions as well. And in this context, this discussion is basically continuation of the previous discussion in terms of identification of the problems or reasons for frauds. So first thing first, when we are suggesting something, we need to focus on due diligence and caution while offering funds to anyone. Now, this is something that can be counterproductive as well, because one of the reasons why we highlighted this is that banks do not have proper standard operating procedures when they are offering loans. So this is something that we need to pay attention to, how we can actually simplify the process of lending but making it more accountable. Second, banks should be very cautious in terms of when they're lending to Indian companies with offshore accounts. And we have seen the recent past that these loans can become big NPAs for these banks. So this is something that is very important aspect. Third is, of course, tightening the internal and external audit systems. Once audit systems are in order, the incidence of loan and ultimately default is actually reduced to a great extent. Now, we have also identified one of the primary reasons for frauds is basically collusion between the employees inside and outside as well, and hence fast rotation of employees in the bank's loan department is very important, so that their activities are continuously under check, and when fresh people come and they take the responsibility, they can identify the loopholes or the problems which might have been left by the previous worker or employee. Next important aspect is that the banking sector as such should have their own internal rating agency, so they are actually free from the clutches of rating agencies from outside, because we have seen that when rating agencies are from outside, they basically get paid by the issuer of bond, and in this context this leads to a lot of problem. So this is something that banks have to take care of. Now, next important aspect is implementation of effective management information system or MIS to monitor early warning signals about business projects. Now, we need to understand that whenever banks offer loan to anyone or any agency, they have to basically regulate the asset for a longer duration, just as to see how the company or the institution or the individual is performing as well, so that they can actually reduce the impact of any kind of bad happening that may happen in future as well. Now, the next important aspect is focus on loan recovery. As already mentioned, one of the reasons is that banks and their employees are under pressure to issue more and more loans, and hence focus on loan recovery is something which is sacrificed. So classification and reassigning of responsibility for loan dispersal and recovery department in the banks, this is a very important aspect. Now, fraud risk assessment, bank needs to carry out fraud risk assessment after every quarter and not on an annual basis. What happens that whenever a loan is extended to any institution or body, if we do this kind of assessment on the every quarter basis, then we can actually reduce the impact of financial frauds and thereby ensuring better NPA at our level of banking. Next important aspect is use of technology as well. Financial frauds can be reduced to a great extent by the use of technologies such as blockchain and artificial intelligence in terms of monitoring financial transactions. So these are actually the way forwards which the banks can basically implement in order to combat the kind of frauds that we see these days. Now, apart from these initiatives or steps, the banks can also look into regulating the activities of chartered accountants. Now, chartered accountant, as we see them today, they're not much regulated body, institutions and individuals, and hence they can be utilized for the purpose of ensuring better accountability of loans and their recovery as well. Apart from that, there are some important recommendations, especially from the perspective of corporate governance of banks. In this case, PJ Nayak committee, which was established by RBI, has suggested groundbreaking reforms. They first suggested that there should be an establishment of Bank Investment Company or BIC. What this BIC is going to do, it is going to hold equity stakes in banks which are presently held by the government. It would function like a passive sovereign wealth fund by the government banks. Now, this is something which is a very important suggestion, so keep this thing as a note. Second important aspect is appointment of independent directors. Now we need to actually appoint independent directors which actually can live up to the reputation which this banking institution basically requires, and both these suggestions are actually path breaking in their value because they will be giving very good corporate governance for the banking and financial institutions. So these two institutional changes are required which are highlighted by the PJ Nayak committee. Page number 8 of today's newspaper has an article which talks about guidelines to prevent unfair trade practices. Now, this topic is important more from the perspective of the prelims examination, as it highlights an important authority, that is the Central Consumer Protection Authority or CCPA. Before understanding what CCPA is, let's try to understand the context of the news. Now, we are aware of the fact that all of us visit hotels or restaurants at some point of time in our life, and whenever we go and ask for bill, many institutions basically add service charge as part of the hotel bill. Now, CCPA has clarified that the service charge is voluntary in nature, and these hotels and restaurants cannot implement service charge on their own without disclosing it to the consumer. Now, this is an important aspect. Now, we also need to know and understand that the CCPA, the body that we talk about, is basically being constituted under the Consumer Protection Act of 2019. And this Consumer Protection Act basically replaced the earlier Consumer Protection Act of 1986. Now, as part of this particular act, it has been defined that a consumer has 6 basic rights. The first right is the right to safety. So we need to understand that whenever a consumer is consuming something and it is actually taking services for someone, so right to safety is part of it. Second, of course, is the right to be informed. Whenever we are actually using or consuming any service, we need to be informed what is in there and how they are basically built. Third is the right to choose, that we should have an option about what all options are available, and based on that we can make an informed choice. Next important aspect is right to be heard. If you have any kind of grievance, you should be in a position to speak your mind, and that is a very important aspect. Next important aspect is related to right to be heard, that if in case some solution is not available, then there is a right to seek redressal as well. Now, this redressal mechanism, we'll be talking about that in detail. And last but not the least, there's a right of consumer education. Yes. So these rights in terms of consumer protection rights are very important. These are safety, right of safety, right to be informed, right to choose, right to be heard, right to of redressal, and right of consumer education. Now, as per the context of the news, the CCPA is basically issuing guidelines in terms of service charge. So let us now understand what is service charge. Service charge is more of a fee which is collected to pay for services associated with the purchase of primary product or service. So you can say that suppose you go and visit a hotel, you order some food, and when food is laid out on your table, and afterwards you pay a service charge for the delivery or service of that particular waiter or even the cook. So this is the basic idea of service charge. Now, normally as highlighted, it is basically collected in the hospitality sector, especially of food and restaurant, that is hotels. But we need to understand that at times these hotels and restaurants do not clearly specify the service charge that they are charging over the bill. So this is something which goes against the right to be informed about the entire episode. Also, there should be a right to choice as well, because service charge is voluntary in nature. If the consumer is satisfied with the service, then he or she may choose to give service charge. Otherwise, they may not give the service charge altogether. Now, in this context, what has happened that hotels and restaurants shall not add service charge automatically as identified by CCPA. Moreover, hotels and restaurants shall not force the consumer to pay service charge. Means that there are hotels and restaurants which basically say that if you're not willing to pay service charge, you are not invited as a guest. So this is a way of actually forcing the consumer to pay service charge, which is basically voluntary in nature. Third important now there are hotels, there are restaurants which basically implement entry restrictions for people who are not willing to pay service charge. So this is again an important aspect. And last but not the least, this is something which is important. More often than not, whenever service charge is being added to the bill, what happens? The service tax is calculated over and above that amount. Now this is something which is illegal, because service charge shall not be collected by adding it along with the food bill, because it causes levying GST on the total amount, which is illegal. So this is something that the CCPA has highlighted. Now let us focus on the duties of CCPA. The Central Consumer Protection Authority shall have following duties, of course. First, of course, is to protect, promote and enforce the right of consumers as a class and prevent violation of consumer rights under this Act. Now let us highlight the duties of CCPA, or the Consumer Protection Act Authority. Now we have already identified the rights, the 6 rights which CCPA promises to actually protect. Based on that, these duties of CCPA have been defined. So first duty is, of course, to protect, promote and enforce the right of consumers, which we've already defined. Second important aspect is to prevent unfair trade practices and ensure that no person engages himself in unfair trade practices. So this basically is offering level playing field to all the people who are competing in the same field. Next important aspect is no false or misleading advertisement is made of any goods or services which contravene the provisions of this Act. And last but not the least, ensure that no person takes part in publication of any advertisement which is false or misleading. So you can see that the basic rights, when you talk about consumer education rights, redressal, heard, choose, informed and safety, these are highlighted through duties of CCP. Now when there are rights, there is a possibility that people might have some kind of problem as well, and for this, consumer may lodge complaint in the National Consumer Helpline, or NCH. This number is basically 1915, that is National Consumer Helpline. Now as far as this particular helpline is concerned, there is a mobile app as well which you can use for actually lodging your complaint, and this can be done through e-Dakhil portal. The consumer may also submit a complaint to the district magistrate or district collector of the concerned district for investigation and subsequent proceedings by the CCPA. So these are the important aspects of CCPA that you must keep in mind. From the perspective of prelims, we need to understand that the Dispute Redressal Commission is actually divided to 3 major stages. First, of course, is district, second is state, and third is national. And their jurisdiction is actually different. So for district, complaints where the value of the goods and services paid as consideration does not exceed 1 crore rupees. So this figure is very important. Keep this thing as a note. Second, when you talk about the state, complaints where the value of the goods and services paid as consideration exceeds 1 crore but does not exceed rupees 10 crore. So this is the second important aspect, state. And third is the national commission, where the consideration exceeds rupees 10 crore. So these are important in terms of pecuniary jurisdiction that are related to CCPA. With this, we have arrived to the question of the day. But before that, let's first take the question of the previous day, that is 11th of July 2022. Now the question was, in the context of polity, which one of the following would you accept as the most appropriate definition of liberty? The correct answer is option D, that is opportunity to develop oneself fully. Now with this, let's take up the question of the day, that is 12th of July 2022, and you have to answer it correctly. The question is, the Central Consumer Protection Authority, or CCPA, under the Consumer Protection Act of 2019 is empowered to: Statement 1, investigate violations of consumer rights. Second, file complaint by itself to respective Consumer Dispute Redressal Commission. Statement 3, issue guidelines against unfair trade practice. Statement 4, impose penalty for false or misleading advertisement by manufacturer. Now you have to select the correct answer using the codes, and codes are option A 2, 3 and 4 only, option B 1, 2 and 4 only, option C 1, 2 and 3 only, and option D 1, 2, 3 and 4.